Hey everyone, and welcome to a very special DF Direct. Yes, we're going to be dedicating an entire show to Starfield here because we've still got so many discussion points to go over, and we haven't even put out our PC tech review yet, at the time of recording at least. And yeah, much to get through on this. So yes, joining me on this one, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Hey, Rich, how's it going? Just straight back from the Starfield here.
Yeah, obviously Oliver produced our very first Starfield content, which was the crucial Xbox Series X and S performance breakdown and comparison and whatnot. And joining me also, John Linneman, who produced our tech review.
Yes, that's right. We both finished up our Starfield content last week, and there was more to talk about, basically, because I have been playing this game a lot, especially on PC, which is something we'll get to today.
So, yeah, well, let's move on with our first piece of discussion. And, yeah, I'm actually going to take a couple of supporter questions on this one, first of all. Hello, DF team, exclamation point. What are your thoughts on the overall performance of Starfield, specifically on the consoles? Can we finally put the, it's only 30 FPS fire out yet, and move on? That one's from Danny. This one from Jordan HJ. Does the 30 FPS cap on console harm the experience in any way? So yeah, this is a really interesting topic that came up time and time again during the preview period, or rather the developer underscore direct that they put out during E3, which is they announced that it's going to be running at 30 frames per second on console. And obviously people were hoping that it would run higher, that it would run at 60 frames per second. So I've decided to produce some quote unquote original content that will hopefully get to the bottom, first of all, of why there is a 30 FPS cap in place, and secondly, whether there is any scope to go higher. But I think, Oliver, I mean, you did the content for the first look at Starfield. Mm-hmm. It is 30 FPS, but it is the consistent 30 FPS that we were looking for, that Todd Howard kind of promised, right?
Yeah, it is very consistent outside of like a couple of areas, maybe on some planets and in certain city areas that can be a little bit more intensive. But in general, it's a very consistent 30 FPS, and it's very stable. And it plays pretty well at 30 as well, I would say. Like, these games are not super fast-paced. I will say that from playing quite a few hours in the PC version, that 60 FPS does benefit the combat quite a bit. But with the motion blur and the stability and the consistency, I did find myself getting used to the 30 FPS update pretty quickly. So I think, especially based on what you've seen from your console-style PC, that 30 FPS probably was the right choice for this title.
Mm-hmm. Would you concur with that, John?
Yeah, I think they made the right choice given what they're attempting to achieve here. And as I pointed out, it is the most stable frame rate they've ever shipped in a console game, right?
Yes.
Like, I understand the expectations for this generation are higher, and I would say by and large, currently even, we're at a pretty good place, right? Most games do ship with 60 frames per second modes these days. There's only been a few big disappointments here and there. But Starfield, you know, Bethesda, their track record, specifically with the type of game they want to build, they don't ship 60 FPS console games, right? Like, Fallout 4 was a mess on launch. Skyrim as well, Oblivion, all of them, all the Fallouts, like, it was not smooth to play on the consoles at all. So the fact that we've actually achieved a reasonably stable frame rate here, that in itself is a nice improvement. And I think the big question about it is always like, how do they justify this? And I think it's more like they've made what I would describe as a Bethesda game, almost a PC game even, and it's on consoles. It's akin to asking, would you like them to massively downgrade Baldur's Gate 3 to run at a stable 60? Because guess what? Even though that does have a performance mode, it don't run at 60 FPS very much. I hope you like 20. But
well, in Act 3, yeah, it does get a bit gnarly.
So that's, you know, with the things going around this week with Starfield, like the potato thing, right? There was the potato GIF or video where they open up the cargo hold and like thousands of individual physics simulated potatoes spill out of this cargo hold in a surprisingly realistic manner. This is the kind of stuff that their games bring to the table that is very specifically a Bethesda thing. And I think I'm glad that they've kept that, and I'm glad they've amped up the physics simulation, because they've done this before, but the level of the simulation and the sheer volume of physicalized objects, it's It's pretty impressive. So I get it. 30 FPS does make sense in this title, just as it does in other titles for various reasons, right?
Yeah. So the question is, what happens if you turn off the 30 FPS cap? And truth is, we don't know, right? But we can try and attempt to figure out what may happen. So this is how I did it. Obviously, a while back, I did a review of a China-only motherboard made by AMD called the 4800S desktop kit. There it is in the background. I'm sure Oliver can pull up some library footage of the board. And I've paired it with a non-XT version of the RX 6700. There's no GPU equivalent in the PC space to what Series X's GPU is. However, this one is very, very close to the PlayStation 5's. 36 compute units, RDNA 2, same amount of texture mapping units, an awful lot of spec points that are very close to PlayStation 5, right? So, yes, basically what I've got here is a PC that's running the Xbox Series X CPU. It's literally the same thing. And a GPU that's very close to the PlayStation 5. Call it a Frankenstein's console, if you like. Yeah, so basically I've installed Starfield on it, and so you're going to be seeing like captions on our frame rate graph saying console settings, but it's got an asterisk on it, and it's basically the closest we could get to console settings. We're running it at 4K resolution, FSR2 quality mode, or rather 67% resolution scaling. DRS, dynamic resolution scaling, it isn't active in any of this testing. It might be active on consoles, right? And I suspect possibly it is, but whatever. Yeah, so first of all, let's take a look at this. Now, weirdly, even though it supports dynamic resolution scaling, Starfield doesn't have a frame rate cap. So I don't quite know how they're calculating it. But what I've done here is to use Special K's frame rate limiter, which has specific options to lock to half refresh rate, 30 FPS, just like the consoles. And yeah, it's even got decent input lag using this latent sync option. So I'm using Aquila here as a pretty heavy spot for testing. You can see that frame time's consistent at 33 milliseconds until we hit areas where we're GPU limited. I'm pretty sure we are GPU limited, by the way, as you'll see later on. But yeah, you can see that we have actually managed to cap Starfield's frame rate, and it looks and feels, when it's running at 30, just like the Xbox Series X version. So sort of job done there. So yeah, that was quite an interesting exercise. But first of all, we're going to be removing the frame rate cap, turning VSync off. So this is, as close as we can get to Starfield on console running with an unlocked frame rate. So yeah, let's return to Aquila. VSync off. We bottom out at 30 frames per second throughout the entire sequence. But yeah, we're sort of in a 30 to 40 FPS no man's land. And I don't know what you think, John, but this kind of validates the idea of a 30 FPS cap, right? Which is if you want consistent performance, basically you have to balance the GPU and the CPU and always have a bit of overhead left over to ensure consistency.
That's exactly right. And as we can see here, that is not achievable with your settings here. But this also presumes then that you're using the same settings as the 30 FPS mode on Xbox, right? So I guess the question is, could we actually reduce these settings further to get there?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, or use dynamic resolution, which
more
we haven't
aggressively.
got active here.
For instance, imagine if you had Series S style settings on a Series X. Could you get to 60? Maybe, maybe not.
We'll test that a bit later on.
We will, exactly.
Yeah, let's continue with just the basic unlocked performance, and had a look at Neon next, which is a very interesting environment. This touches 40 FPS. But that nightclub area with all the lighting there does seem to be quite heavy. Again, it's another validation here that 30 FPS cap is based on this CPU and GPU profile is basically the right move. My house at Nesoi, very foliage heavy, forests, that kind of thing.
Wait, Rich,
super hard.
You did that? You did the thing where you have like the at the beginning of the game where you shackle yourself with a mortgage?
Yes, and I deeply regret it, but it did throw up this instantly interesting GPU bound scenario where we were looking for foliage and forests, and it's super hard on the GPU. If VSync on, it's actually dipping below 30 FPS, but with VSync off, we're kind of around that sort of area and above. So again, this all says to me that 30 FPS is the right move. And again, when you have that first fight scene at the beginning of the game, 30 to 40 FPS. I mean, it all sort of points towards the concept that the game has, basically been balanced for 30 FPS on this class of hardware. Now, the question is, can we go any higher? Because we've got that statement from Todd Howard saying, well, parts of the game run to 60 frames per second, right? And basically space combat, this is right at the beginning of the game again, 35 to 50 frames per second. I'd say this was, well, going into this test, I thought that would be our best chance of hitting 60. Don't quite manage it. But the first research station mission basically is pretty much in 50 to 60 frames per second territory, which I think is possibly validation of what Todd was referring to. I mean, this game is so big, there's almost certainly going to be areas that will run at 60, right? Depending on density. So, we've got a PC here that's got basically CPU and GPU performance that's going to be in the ballpark of what the consoles are doing, and it all validates the 30 frames per second side of things. And the other thing I think I noticed here is that we've seen no evidence that at 30 frames per second or even going higher that we're CPU limited anywhere. So, basically, like what you said earlier, John, maybe if there was to be a performance mode, they could drop the resolution and then basically achieve a different kind of hardware balance, which I found quite an interesting notion. It's something we can do, right? So the way I did that was to basically think to myself, well, how would a potential performance mode work for Xbox Series X? We've got Series S running at 1440p, 900p internal resolution, right, with FSR2 upscaling. And it looks all right, doesn't it? That's something you mentioned in your content, Oliver. The Series X versus Series S comparison, 1440p versus 4K. It looked pretty decent, right?
Yeah, it looks quite good. And it's a smaller difference than what we usually see between the two machines. And really, in typical play, the only difference that you're really noticing is that the Series S is a little bit softer, but the various settings downgrades outside of that don't really make much of an impact, and the game actually looks quite good on Series S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in theory, then, what if we sort of tweaked resolution downwards to 1440p to match Series S to unlock more performance, but I haven't reduced any of the other quality settings, which Series S has got a few things that have been tweaked there. So we go back to Aquila first of all, VSync off again. It's now in the high 40s to begin with. And I'd still think we're actually GPU limited here. But as we move into the town, we get some pretty aggressive frame time issues, which I do think is a CPU limit. But most of the time, we're still beyond 40 frames per second. And so, possibly a 40 frames per second mode with a different GPU balance or a different tweak to dynamic resolution scaling bounds could be viable, or possibly something, a VRR specific mode. And the further I tested this, the more interesting results I got. So we had some interesting results with Neon just running it unlocked, but running it with the reduced resolution unlocked, Neon basically runs locked to 60 frames per second, which I couldn't quite believe. Yeah. And then I went into the nightclub, some minor dips there, but, the whole thing was basically running at 60. And there's no real need as such to confine ourselves to 1440p. You could, in theory, just have dynamic resolution scaling, pushing the resolution as high as possible until it hits the CPU limit. Space combat, perhaps unsurprisingly, 60 frames per second when I rerun that test. Now, obviously, it's early on in the game. Maybe some of the later battles are a bit more intense, but, clearly we've got CPU and GPU headroom to get a much higher frame rate than 30 if you tweak that resolution. The research lab obviously was quite interesting in our first tests because we were in the 50s there, just at 4K resolution. En route to the research lab in our sort of makeshift performance mode, mid 40s upwards, but once we actually get inside the research area, so again, what I tested was basically locked to 60 frames per second. which I found really, really interesting. Now, going back to my horrific misjudgment in getting that that house necessary, I think we're still GPU limited here, even with the reduced resolution, but we're still north of 40 frames per second. So, yeah, I'd say this is pretty interesting testing, right? Because I think there is grounds here for possibly having a 40 FPS mode. Now, obviously, the scope of the test is limited, right?
Yeah.
And we've no idea really how representative our makeshift Frankenstein's console is of actual Series X performance, but it's an interesting indicator. And it's quite interesting. So thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, so my takeaway from this is that there's two things that could be feasible as a patch for the game. One, you've already mentioned it, the 40 frames per second mode. I do think they could probably get enough headroom with some additional work to actually reach 40 frames per second pretty steadily. So I think that would actually be a pretty smart addition to the game. Given that 40 FPS, as we've reiterated, is exactly in between 30 and 60, right, in terms of frame time. So it does feel good. But secondly, I would actually say that a VRR specific mode, and I'm not sure how they'd enable this to the player, might also be a nice win, provided they cap it at, say, 60. Because the Xbox, of course, has full low frame rate compensation support. So you get the full VRR range down to, I think, like 20 FPS, maybe low. I can't remember the exact minimum, but it would handle all of Starfield, which would conceivably enable a fully just unlocked experience that would actually still look consistent and smooth to the player. Because I do think many areas in this game are going to be well above 40. It's just some of the more busy areas and specific sequences where you're dropping the frame rate, as we saw. So I do think that the overall gameplay experience would benefit from that. The question is, are they going to do it? Because there isn't actually that much of a precedent for this, right?
Yeah.
Like on the Xbox side, they've not done it much.
Yeah.
We've seen it in Plague Tale. In Requiem, whichever one it is, the most recent one,
the second one.
It is Requiem.
It is Requiem. I don't. Okay, Innocence is the first one, then Requiem, right?
Yeah.
And then the third one's going to be like Electric Boogaloo or something. But that one had a 40 FPS mode on Xbox, but I think that's the only one. Can you guys think of another? Has anybody else done it? There was the
40 FPS on Xbox.
There was a flight simulator mode, which brought it up to like fully uncapped, but I feel like 40 FPS on Xbox is only in Plague Tale Requiem.
Because they don't have visibility into it, do they, as the developer?
I think Asobo said that they have some heuristic algorithm that determines whether VRR is active or not. But the SDK can be updated at any time.
I'm sure they could find a way to make this work, and I think they should. I hope that they've explored this avenue, but I do not think that they could necessarily reach a stable 60 FPS mode, given the performance load of this game. Also, given what we know about the performance on PC, they're already at pretty low settings here, and I just don't think that you're going to get there. There's not the headroom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just say that there are always, I think, going to be two major exceptions to that, which are Aquila and New Atlantis, which do seem fairly CPU limited. On consoles, even at 30 FPS, they're dropping quite substantially in some moments in Universal. Yeah, exactly. And PC quite badly CPU limited there, even on higher end CPUs, like on my 13700K. It's still like a little bit messy there. So those are two areas where there would be some issues, although there are already issues in the current build in those areas. So maybe you just eat that.
I think the other thing, of course, is that the testing here is extremely limited, and the whole point of this engine, the reason it's architected as it is that you can do things like stick 200,000 potatoes in an airlock and then open the door, right? There's no performance mode is ever going to be designed around those sort of bizarre scenarios that this engine can deliver. But, I think it would be an interesting addition to the game, and I'm curious if they're going to do anything like it. And I'm wondering whether it's actually kind of needed, because 30 FPS is fine, fundamentally. It's kind of like another one of those pre-launch controversies that actually turned out to be, bit of a non-event.
I mean, that's how I recommended Horizon Forbidden West in 30 frames per second mode, Final Fantasy 16, absolutely. 30 FPS mode, 60 is great when you can achieve it. Higher is even better, but in some games it's perfectly acceptable, as we've been saying the entire time.
Yeah, I think in this game in particular, though, they do have quite a lot of headroom, I would say, on the image quality to open up a little bit of a higher performance mode, maybe a balanced mode, something like 40 FPS. Because when you look at the image quality, especially on Series X, it's already achieving a very good looking 4K output image. They can definitely lower that down to like, somewhere maybe between the Series S settings and Series X settings in terms of resolution and output. And they could achieve a really good visual result that way. So I think it's totally viable from that perspective as well.
Would you make let's say there's an unlocked performance mode. Would you consider it to be VRR only to get the best result and to basically ensure that there isn't a disaster, John?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, at the same time, some people do like options like this, right? I would never play it this way. I think it looks terrible without VRR, but there are going to be folks that just prefer a higher frame rate regardless of the frame consistency, and I respect that. So maybe it is something that should be made available for all, provided there's like kind of a warning on it, like, hey, your frame rate is going to be unstable, but it's just going to run as fast as it can, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, I just want to quickly pick up this question from supporter Crowley. Will this play on a 10 gigabyte GPU at 1440p? And the answer is, well, this 6700's got 10 gigs actually, and it's only using about 5 to 6 from what I can see. So I actually think, well, Alex will confirm this in his content, but I think an 8 gig GPU will be fine for 4K. Which is quite impressive, bearing in mind some of the texture assets are of very, very high quality. But let's move on to our sort of next.
Was that Mr. Crowley? Like, are we talking like what went on in your head? Sorry. That's got. We're bringing Ozzy into this somehow.
John, you've actually moved on from the Xbox Series X version.
I've ascended, as they say.
You've ascended. Oh dear. You've moved on to PC.
Sort of. And I'll explain.
Okay. But I think it's fair to say that the PC version is fine. There's some low-hanging fruit and changes that we would have expected Bethesda to make. But they kind of haven't. But basically, it's been modder's paradise since day one. So how are you actually playing the game? Actually, let's take this supporter question from Matthew Barron. The game looks so washed out in HDR. Can they fix this easily? Now, this is something that you have been looking to fix, right? In the PC build, at least.
Yeah, to a degree. So yes, I have been primarily playing on the PC in my free time and at night relaxing with the Xbox version before bed. So kind of going back and forth thanks to the cross-save feature, which largely works well, but not always. Sometimes the PC version doesn't like to sync up with the server, and it requires me to stop and restart certain services in Windows 11, which is kind of annoying, but by and large, it works pretty well. But yeah, HDR, I only play on OLED screens now, and I prefer to play in HDR. This game on PC does not support native HDR. Not that the native HDR is all that good in the first place, as I pointed out in my video. It uses auto HDR, and this does amp up the highlights somewhat over the Xbox presentation, but at the expense of further raising the black levels, right? And it's kind of a weird thing though, because the appearance of the blacks, as they say, washed out colors, that is, I believe, an intentional choice from the developers. It's sort of a color grading thing. It reminds me of Blade Runner 2049, which is not an especially bright movie. It has this very sort of flat, kind of like graded look to give it like this low contrast sci-fi appearance. And I can respect what they're trying to do there, but I do think for a game that you spend so much time in, you want a little bit more punchiness. And that's where some of the fixes come into play. So the first big one for me, and this was the one that changed everything for the visuals, is Special K. We love Special K here on Digital Foundry from Chaldean. It's awesome, right? It is truly the Swiss Army knife for PC gamers. And one of my favorite features of this is the ability to essentially inject HDR into a game. And this actually works on games that don't support HDR at all. They put up a fix for the current version of Special K works perfectly with this, is what I'm saying. Initially, there were some issues which were kind of funny, actually. One of them turned the ground into like Death Stranding, like oil sludge, which was funny, but that's fixed. But with some tweaking, I don't know. I wouldn't describe it as correct or incorrect, but it looks better to me. You get much brighter highlights, and then by changing the gamma here, you can actually sort of bring down the black levels. I don't bring them down too far because one, I don't want to crush blacks, but also I want to preserve some of their color grading, right? So it's just kind of creating a wider dynamic range for the image. So everything that should be bright appears brighter to the eye, and then everything that's kind of in shadow is darkened, but not all the way. And with these settings here, I'm pretty confident I'm pretty happy with it, complacent with it. It looks good to me. And it's a decent replacement for really high quality native HDR, but not as far as I'd like, because fundamentally this game is limited like internally at 8-bit color. So they don't have a 10-bit pipeline in there for some reason. So you don't get that full color clarity and range. And there are some limits to it, which is unfortunate, but still, if you're playing on PC, go check out Special K. But if you're like, but John, I don't like that color grading, it's way too intense, somebody else has made a mod for that as well. And there is the option to essentially remove it entirely. And it does change the look of the game quite a bit. That's the beauty of it. It's up to the user whether they like it or not. If I suggest giving it a shot to see what you think. It makes a much punchier, contrasty image. Like some of the interior spaces that are dark, I was thinking more like, oh, this is more like Doom 3 now than Starfield, right? Where you just get really dark shadows, and it can look pretty cool, I'll admit, but that is something possible. So that's the first thing I would recommend users doing. Now, if you're on, I'm going to give this as sort of advice as well. If you're playing on Xbox and you're like, oh man, I'm left out, the HDR sucks, and I can't use Special K on my Xbox. Not yet anyways, who knows? There is a way to improve the performance of the HDR content, and I don't like doing this, but you can adjust your TV settings to compensate somewhat. And there's actually two potential approaches here. One, mismatching the RGB color space. So like, you know how you have like RGB high, RGB low? It's like basically 0 to 255 or 16 to 235. Essentially you want to set I forget the order it goes, but you need one of them to be 0 to 255 and the other to be 16 to 235, and it crushes blacks normally, right? Well, in this case, it actually kind of, it pushes out the contrast a little bit, and it brings some extra richness to the shadows. It's technically not correct, but some people might like the look of it. You can also go in there and adjust either the brightness setting, knock it down a little bit, or on the newer LG OLEDs, there's like this fine tuning option for whites and blacks. And if you actually bring the black fine tune setting down from 10 at the default to 5, that also helps a lot. So try any of those, see how they look. It might make your HDR experience look a little better. But fundamentally, what we really need here is Bethesda to actually implement real HDR controls in the game, because there's none. There's not even a brightness control. And that's what is missing here, is the option to fine tune it from within the game. So that's HDR.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
That was a bit of an onslaught of information there, but you're not finished, are you, John? Actually, well, let's talk about DLSS, because it was it was a massive hot potato.
It was.
And basically, after months of basically no comment, or rather a month of no comment on as to whether DLSS was blocked, they've basically come out and said, well, actually, they can do whatever they like. And yet the game didn't launch with DLSS. Supporter question here from Gatti. What's really happening with DLSS on Starfield? Are AMD's comments misinterpreted, or is it a 4D chess move? or what is it? This one from Spudnik. Hi guys, how much do you believe the performance / visual quality of the game is held back due to lack of DLSS support? Obviously not confirmed by Bethesda as of writing this, but I would be amazed if you now told me DLSS is available. Let me dream! ! Well, the good news is that once again, similar to other deficiencies or other things that people are not too happy with the PC version, of Starfield, there have been mods, and basically there was a DLSS mod on day one.
Wasn't it like within the
on,
hour or something? Like
it was ridiculous. And basically, as we record this, it's launch day, official launch day, September the 6th, and it's now very readily available, a DLSS 3 frame generation modification for Starfield. So I think the good news is that whether it's 4D, 3D, 5D, however many dimensions there are to this particular sponsorship, there is DLSS support for Starfield. Question is, John, is it any good? Because some of these homebrew mods for DLSS have been a bit hit and miss, but I think you're playing with DLSS now, aren't you?
I am indeed. And in fact, it made a gigantic difference to the image quality. So there's actually several different DLSS mods out there, I should note. And some are simpler to install than others. I'm using, I forget what it is. It's the simplest one. I didn't want to use Reshade because that conflicts with Special K. And I'm not using the Pure Dark option either for frame generation because that also conflicts with Special K. So because it uses a weird version of HDR. So the main thing I found is that DLSS or DLAA does dramatically improve the image, especially in specific areas such as neon. There is a lot of the typical visual noise you get in FSR2 here. I actually think FSR2 looks pretty okay in this game by and large. I think it does a good job. It's better than a lot of other implementations of it. They've tuned it pretty well. But there's definitely those areas with a lot of high frequency details, sharp contrast edges, fine grates and all kinds of stuff in the textures that causes it to kind of break. I highlighted one at the spaceport in my video as well. You saw that, right? Where when the ship's pulling away, like the whole thing is just a shimmery mess. There's a lot of that there. DLSS solves all of it. It's just a pristine looking image. It looks better than just running native resolution with their built-in TAA. Like it's so temporally stable now. You get these super clean, smooth edges. It almost makes the game look super sampled to a degree, especially if you're using DLAA or a high setting on the resolution slider, because fundamentally that's kind of how this implementation differs a little bit in that it plugs in place of FSR2. The resolution slider then functions between 50 and 100%, 100% being DLAA, but you actually have full control over the internal resolution up to 4K or whatever your monitor setting is, right? So you can kind of adjust that to your liking. There's also the sharpness thing. So sharpness is decoupled from DLSS now. And if you want to use that, you actually do need to use Reshade or some other approach to it because the sharpness slider in the game does not apply to the default DLSS. But I think it doesn't really need it. I would say it looks good enough from where I'm sitting, in front of a 42-inch OLED, and I think it looks great this way. So I think Alex is going to have some really good comparisons in there because I basically was like, dude, you got to go over to Neon and compare there. And sure enough, he sent me the whole SpongeBob eye singe meme after seeing it with FSR2. That's one area where it helps a lot to switch over to DLSS.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because Oliver, the FSR2 implementation, it's right. It's not perfect, but it looks fine, I think, generally, when you look at it on consoles.
Yeah, broadly speaking, it looks quite good. But when you go to Neon in particular, like when you look at long angles of Neon and you're looking at the kind of scaffolding and the lighting, it does start to shimmer quite badly. And I noted this in my my piece on both Series S and Series X to about an equal degree. It also is not perfect with the game's native TAA either. So it's just a tough area for that image quality. In general, though, the game does look, I think, quite sharp and relatively clean with FSR2, especially given that you have motion blur by default. That's helping to hide some of the artifacts that you normally see in motion. For consoles, I think it's great. Obviously, for high-end PC nowadays, the bar is a little bit higher. So the DLSS mods, from what I've seen, I haven't played with myself, but from what I've seen, they deliver quite tremendous image quality relative to FSR2 in those areas where FSR2 isn't perfect.
I mean, I thought the image quality on my testing was actually okay with FSR2 in quality mode. It does seem to be okay, but I think generally speaking, though, you don't know what you're missing until you see it. And thankfully, the mod seems to, bring the full range of DLSS advantages to the table. There are no drawbacks at all.
Not that I found yet, anyway. Everything seems to work just fine. And like you say, the implementation of FSR2 is quite good. And you might be inclined to think it's perfectly fine. But then when you switch over to DLSS, you really realize, like, oh, okay, all those little edge cases where there was noise in the image or it didn't look quite as sharp or clean or whatever, DLSS takes care of it, which I think does showcase how much more capable that still is. Although FSR2 is, I do think it's pretty good at this point, so I don't want to knock it for that. They've also added support for XESS via a mod. However, I have not tested that because it doesn't make sense to use it on an RTX card, right? But I would like to actually see how this game runs on Intel now that it's been updated, I think, to work. Because I believe it's launched in a state where it didn't run on Intel's ARC cards at all.
Yeah, well, that's something that we're looking into and trying to get some answers on, which is visibility that the IHVs had to the game pre-launch, bearing in mind it's a sponsored title, because we've heard stories in the past about, basically the way a day one driver comes about. It isn't that NVIDIA or AMD or whoever get the game on day one and just twiddle some knobs and put a new driver out. It takes time, right?
Yeah.
And for that, they need access to the game in its early stages or pre-launched by a good degree of time to get to grips with it, right? And I can understand if it is a sponsored title and there's bespoke integrations, right?
Sure.
That one vendor would probably not want the others to see those integrations, right? So I can imagine that is possibly what happened here. Who knows? But the point is that if a game like of this stature launches and you're not getting optimum performance from your GPU, I'd say that's arguably worse than locking out vendor-specific features like DLSS, because it's really not great. But that's something we're just going to have to talk about and try and dig into a bit more and try and get some comments from the IHVs.
I do want to comment, though, on this game specifically. So we obviously were talking about this lack of DLSS pre-launch, and lo and behold, it didn't turn out to be an issue thanks to modders. And I want to point out that is one of the key strengths for Bethesda sticking with Creation Engine, is that the moddability for this game is just off the charts. That's what has allowed these games to continue to remain popular for so long. Like, all the modding community is built around this, the tools that they provide, everything that they offer. It's such a moddable game in a way that a lot of games aren't, right? And you can see that straight away. Like, there is an argument to be said that maybe Bethesda should have implemented all these different things themselves, but at the same time, this modding is something that's really built. The game is built for this, to be modular, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these mods eventually make their way into Xbox as well. I mean, Fallout 4 had mod support, right? So it's not impossible.
And Skyrim,
that's right, the re-release or whatever.
Actually, while we're on this topic, this supporter question from Busy Tracks. Hey DF, what are your thoughts on the upgrades to the Creation Engine? What are the most notable upgrades? Where are some areas that you believe could be improved further after playing the game? Oliver, thoughts?
In terms of specific upgrades to the Creation Engine, I'm not too sure because I didn't do a lot of cross comparison with Fallout 4. But what I can say is that a lot of the interior spaces just look absolutely beautiful. Their PBR system is fantastic. Plastics and glass, their volumetrics, all that stuff looks really, really good. Artificial areas look fantastic. In terms of areas that could probably still use some improvement, the character faces are of, I would say, a pretty decent quality overall and are definitely a huge improvement. But, there's some stuff there that's not amazing, obviously. But part of that is just a concession to how big these games are, I feel. The one area that I did think could use some improvement and was not great in prior Creation Engine games either is some of the stuff they have with foliage shading. The trees don't have natural self-shadows to me. The ferns, if you go through New Atlantis, the lighting looks quite flat on a lot of foliage elements. So that's probably my biggest visual bugbear in this game. And I think it's something they could definitely improve a fair bit further to get it up to kind of par.
Okay, interesting. Well, John, you did do the comparisons to prior Bethesda games,
Lightly, yeah.
studios titles. So, what do you think about the upgrades to the engine? I mean, well, from my perspective, I think Oliver nailed it, which is that the handling of materials is just outstanding compared to prior titles. It is a generation beyond what we saw in the Fallout 4 and Fallout 76.
Yeah, I'd say that's the biggest change here. They actually shifted to the Forge, which is a cross-platform rendering framework that supports Creation Engine, of course. And that is likely they built on that, and the result is a much more capable rendering framework versus what they had in the past. With a lot of the modern features you expect from modern rendering, that looks really good. I do think that the PBR pipeline, the quality of their indirect lighting, given that it's dynamic and not ray traced, is pretty impressive overall, despite some of the errors you can uncover. And generally everything just has this like level of granularity that we've never actually seen in a Bethesda game before, where normally if you just zoom the camera in and like look closely at any random object, they didn't usually look very good. And you can really see it in Fallout 4. It just, they don't hold up under close scrutiny, but that's not the case any longer. And the computers and the technology scattered throughout the Starfield universe, I think, is shockingly good in terms of actual fidelity. Like, you can zoom all the way in, and I did in my video on these things, and there's just tremendous texture detail there, which is excellent to see. And that, I think, that's the best they've ever done by a long shot. That alone makes a huge difference. But as you said, Oliver, there are areas, especially the more natural environments, where things don't necessarily come together. Foliage and lighting can look weird and create kind of strange results. And it's exactly as I predicted on the Direct last time, where I said there's going to be bad actors out there posting shots of things to make it look bad, without context, or, they did exactly what I said, like to the
the standout one was the Horizon versus Starfield NPC comparisons.
Yeah, I mean the end. So this is interesting stuff. I do want to explain a little bit about their approaches to this, because we've seen it in both Sony and Microsoft games. But first, let me talk about Ratchet and Clank. When that game came out, there was this thing going around where people were jumping into an area of the world where you're not supposed to go. And then they were positioning the camera in a strategic way to essentially reveal some of the faults in the rendering. And then they were parading this around as like, this is representative of the visuals in Ratchet and Clank. It was extremely dishonest, right? The same thing kind of happened here, but in a different way. So the NPCs, as I pointed out in my video, they're often very ugly, right? They don't look very good, but there's a interesting peculiarity with them where their eyes track the player movement, right? So what they did was essentially go into New Atlantis, where the NPCs actually look the worst, by the way. I don't know why, but it's specifically the NPCs in that city look the worst in the entire game. It's very strange. But by crouching before them and getting the camera at a sharp angle below them, you actually cause their eyes to shift down, which gives this really weird, like, kind of effect, which it takes what are already not great looking NPCs and makes them look significantly goofier. And so when you show that to somebody that doesn't understand what they're looking at, they just see something that looks really stupid, right? And you put that next to a game like Horizon Forbidden West has the best NPCs I've ever seen in a game, like, an open world kind of game like this, right? Like the best bar none. They absolutely nailed it. So that's already kind of that's an interesting comparison there, but they very specifically make Starfield look worse than it should by manipulating the camera and the behavior of the NPCs to paint them in this negative light. And I mean, this is what I said last week that they would do, and that's exactly what people did. And it's fascinating to see it. But there's other problems with them, of course, like the skin shading. There's no subsurface scattering going on, and just some of the lighting is really harsh in spots that can make it look especially weird. So all of that comes together. Although conversely, and we made it into a Donkey video in his review of Starfield, where somebody else was upset that apparently they were like, Digital Foundry lied because they say you can't swim, and then they show the character swimming in third person, not understanding that, as the video pointed out, we were talking about swimming beneath the water, right, as a mechanic. And yeah, you can't do that in this game. And it's funny how people take little bits of information either out of context or, designed to deceive other people, and then they post it everywhere, and it just floods the internet. I've reached the point now where I find this entertaining at this point, because it's happened for I've been monitoring this for a decade now, and it's predictable and funny, and that's exactly what happened here. But I think by and large, I think Starfield looks good, but like with any of these open world games, it's very easy to point out areas where it falls short.
Well, I'll tell you what makes me laugh is that this whole sort of manufactured thing about Digital Foundry lying, where you basically spent days using photo modes to show the game in its best possible light.
Yeah, exactly.
It just doesn't really make sense, to the point where, we've had a few people saying, why didn't Bethesda show the game looking like this, like you did, John? And it's like,
I know, exactly. But I always do this with games. It's not just Starfield. When I cover a big game like this, I like to showcase the visuals and really help people. It's like I view my video as like a camera viewfinder for the audience, as a way to bring the focus to what looks awesome and then explain why it looks awesome. So that was the kind of goal with that video.
And I don't think it's too hard either, because a lot of areas in Starfield look fantastic.
Absolutely.
And most of the time, I would say the vast majority of the time, the game at least looks very good. And in some of those interiors, the game can truly look beautiful at times. So I don't think that that those little areas that people might be pointing out on Twitter or something are at all representative of the majority of the experience. It's just tiny little areas of the game that might not look quite as good as the other areas.
I mean, there's so much we could talk about here. Going back to that original question about upgrades to the creation engine, the combat is worlds beyond previous Bethesda game titles. It's really good. There's a lot going on in this game, and we can just barely scratch the surface. I'm going to mention a couple of questions here, and we're going to start with let's talk about this one. Agsma says, have you found an NPC that tosses you into the stratosphere like the giants of Skyrim, or something as inane during your playthroughs? This one from Concrete Llama. Is this really Bethesda's most bug-free game, quote unquote? What's the weirdest thing you've seen so far, or has the whole experience been relatively uneventful, bug performance wise? Oliver?
Well, I haven't found any NPCs that toss you into the stratosphere, but I did shoot someone once and their body recoiled in a very dramatic way, up 10 feet or something, which is pretty funny. In terms of the bugs, I don't know that I've actually noticed. I've played for probably 30 or 35 hours at this point. I'm actually not sure if I've noticed anything that I registered as a bug, with the exception of some clipping, through doors, a little bit of clipping of body parts, things like this. I'm not sure if I would call those bugs. They were unsightly on maybe one or two occasions, but it's been a remarkably bug-free experience. And speaking as someone who played a lot of Fallout 4 and Skyrim at launch, it's way more polished than those titles.
Have you seen anything, John, that's disconcerting?
I will say I've encountered some bugs, but I would say they are significantly less. Most bugs seem to be centered around character navigation and collision, right? So NPCs getting stuck on things and then behaving weirdly, or enemies doing the same. It usually amounts to clipping through object and then vibrating up and down wildly. That happens not constantly, but it definitely happens. And I've also seen an NPC just kind of float up through the hull in my ship and just kind of get wedged in there, which I thought was entertaining. And also some enemies, I forget what they're called. There's these flying creatures that remind me of cliff racers from Morrowind. I had intended to do a gag with that, with the Morrowind battle music, but I didn't get around to it. But I killed a couple of those things, and they just froze. The physics are supposed to activate on their dead bodies, but they did not. So they just stopped in midair and just fell slowly to the ground, and then clipped through my ship in a weird way, because I was standing next to the ship. and that made me laugh. So it's mostly that stuff, except for there was one with the doors. I sent you guys that screenshot. You remember that? Where the airlocks, the airlock doors, airlocks, you press the button, they animate, door opens.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, the airlock doors were like 50 feet up in the air, and they were just like above the entry to the place. So it's like, whatever, you press the button and they animated. But that was the most interesting though, because those bunkers and such, I always was like, do they use these airlock doors specifically as like hide loading, rather than a loading screen? But it turns out that since the doors glitched out, you could just kind of walk right in there, because both doors were just wide open, right? They were floating in the sky. There was no pause. So you could just walk on in and explore around and come right back out. And everything was functioning normally, except the doors. When you press the button, you'd see them animate up in the sky, but they didn't actually like block you from anything. So
it's just extra air.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the people, if you were to go in there in a real space colony with the helmet off, then you might be in trouble if your doors were floating above the base. But in a game, it's no big deal. So that was pretty funny.
I think basically this is an example where social media has been quite interesting in terms of validating that it's a relatively bug-free experience. Because if you go back to some of the prior BGS launches, like some of the Fallout games or whatnot, we've seen images of characters with no faces, just like suspended eyes in midair. We've seen heads kind of rotating for no reason, and yet we've not actually seen anything that bad, I don't think, on Twitter that's actually gone viral, because it seems to be overall a pretty solid game.
I mean, you're talking to someone that finished Cyberpunk on the PC pre-launch and had a mostly good time. I had some bugs, of course, but yeah. I think if you poke and prod at these games, you can break them a little bit more, but it does seem to be the case where this one is less breakable than usual for them, which is pretty impressive, I would say. It's a weird, it's like damning by faint praise or something there. It's a weird thing to say, but it's true. It's
literally the only thing I've really seen that sort of has gained traction has been the weird looking NPCs. I've not really seen anything beyond that.
Which, yeah, they're pretty bad. And then, obviously the loading is still an issue. Loading screens, I would say that they're not. That is ultimately probably the biggest disappointment still for me, is how the game is basically segmented like that. I suspect that given how the creation engine works and, all the various things that they're running under the surface with all this item tracking and the physics and everything, that they probably could not pull that off where it's fully seamless. But who knows? Maybe the modding community will find a way to fix this, or not fix it, but, make changes to the way the map system works. Though even then it becomes difficult, because you go into Aquila, right? And you want to go into the rock or whatever it's called. The building interior doesn't match the exterior in terms of scale, right? So they kind of take some liberties with that to flourish or to flesh out the interior spaces, which is funny. Actually, it does. One complaint I do have that I've started to encounter after many, many, many hours in this game is that there are repeating sort of bases or mines, or there's basically repeating spaces within the game. And we knew that the game relied on procedural generation, right? And that's expected. But I was a little surprised to see like exact duplicates of entire facilities across multiple planets. Like the first time it happened, it actually confused me, because I was like, wait a minute, have I been to this planet? Because the rock formations, the exterior, the interior space, it was 100% identical. Every enemy in exactly the same place. It felt like I was doing the same mission a second time, but it was not the same planet, and it's right. Confusing. So, I mean, I can see why that would happen, but I'm a little surprised they didn't find a way to vary that aspect up a little bit more.
Yeah, maybe some sort of roguelike sort of randomized variation of similar content.
Yeah, at least change where the enemies are, or like take it into like individual modules and shuffle the modules around. Something to just vary it up a little bit, because it does feel weird when you go to a planet and encounter the exact same like facility.
Well, that leads us into an interesting question from supporter Frank the Tonka Truck. Expect to see that Tonka Truck as a mod within Starfield imminently. But anyway, the question, does the procedural generated content actually fit seamlessly into the handcrafted content, or is there an obvious turn in quality where it's visually apparent that something was generated, like terrain with rocks colliding with ferns? Oliver, thoughts?
Well, from a visual perspective, I think that the proc gen stuff fits in just fine, and I think all the terrain is probably proc gen to some degree or another. That's probably my expectation on all the planets, even the planets that are like the prominent ones with cities. That's probably how the terrain, at least in part, was generated. So I think their procedural generation system looks visually quite good. In practice, playing the game, it's another story with a lot of that content, especially on the planets that are just generated according to, a random seed and whatnot.
Yeah, so that's that is kind of obvious. I mean, having built enough stuff in Unreal using different like meshes combined with the terrain stuff, and I can almost just feel them copying like this is the base aesthetic for this very specific thing, and literally just copy pasting all those meshes as like one giant grouping into another spot on the terrain and kind of sticking it there. You can kind of exactly feel where it starts and ends, right? Where it's plugged into the terrain. They clearly did some extra work to make the really big cities feel unique and special. Like the way New Atlantis is nestled into that mountain, it feels like it's part of the terrain mostly. If you go around the outskirts, you can kind of get that feeling that it just goes from here's the city to like here's random terrain, right? But I think it works well enough, and it's probably the best they could have done given this how many places you can go. My only complaint there really relates to like this feeling of like you have a city, you have the city limits, and then you have nothing. Right, it's just terrain,
Right.
As if you would build a civilization on a planet and just have that one space and that's it. Like, New Atlantis has a bunch of coffee shops, and I'm just imagining the people like they just live there. They've got that same brand of coffee shop, in the different districts, a few other shops, and some office buildings, and like that is their life. Right, like that's their entire existence. Like how many people actually would live on that city? It doesn't. It's a game, right? But it's still when you start thinking about those things when the visual quality reaches a certain point, and it kind of makes me honestly think back to like their older works, like Daggerfall, where you just have this gigantic map of like largely similar looking like flat terrain, with like occasional like city places kind of jammed in there, right? It doesn't, so that feels a little bit weird, but I don't know how you really solve that, like, at least with while humans are still making things, like it just seems like such a gigantic problem, right?
I think that given the size and scope and scale of the game they were making, I think they arrived on probably the correct solutions.
Yeah.
But like for me, the proc gen stuff is probably the worst aspect of the game, and the aspect of the game that I really don't like so much, because it leads to like there not being very much meaningful exploration. I played a couple hours of Skyrim on my Switch the other day just to give myself a refresher for how that felt like, and you could basically go in any direction through this contiguous landmass in a game like Skyrim or Fallout 4 and see like landmarks, quests, cities, just go around, explore, and you'd see meaningful content. And in Starfield, basically, you have like a Mass Effect 2 style galaxy map. You go to random locations. You might go to a planet that might have a mission on it, but you just go straight to the marker. Nothing else is interesting. It's all just proc gen. And I expected that at least for the planets with cities on them, there'd be more meaningful content. That really isn't the case. So that's really I really like Starfield. I've enjoyed playing it quite a lot, and I'm going to keep playing it for sure. And there are lots of aspects of the gameplay that I really do enjoy. But I really do miss that feeling of exploring a handcrafted world with lots of interesting stuff to see, because that was always the really big appeal of older Bethesda titles for me.
Yeah.
It's an interesting point that you made, John, about the sort of city sitting there in isolation. I think we talked about it a bit in the last
we did.
DF Direct Weekly. But yeah, basically there's no ecosystem there.
No.
You go to Skyrim and you're seeing the entire ecosystem. There's farmers, there's castles, there's kings, there's peasants. You're seeing the whole sort of tapestry of life as depicted in that game, whereas everything is kind of a bit more isolated, and you would expect more from a colonized world than just a city, right?
That's what I was thinking. Comparing it to something like Cyberpunk again, like you when you wander through those streets, whether you like the game or not, there's a sense that every single bit of that entire game world is handcrafted and designed to represent something very specific. And it's the same with The Witcher 3, I would argue, where it's just this gigantic, seamless, super crafted thing. And I know you can't do it at the scale of what they're trying to do with Starfield, but I do wish at least the main worlds, like where Jemison, where New Atlantis is, had actually been built closer to that. Maybe not at that quality level, given, you know, how much other stuff's in the game, but I wish there had been a little bit more of that cohesiveness there, like a full planet. The closest they get to this, I think, is still Neon, which conceptually I think is very interesting, being that it's essentially a planet of ocean, and they've built this gigantic cyber city on these giant metal pylons, and it's on Neon where I actually felt the closest in terms of like they have a functioning kind of society here, right? Like you get all the outskirts around on the exterior with the different gangs and types of shops there. You get that middle section, that like long narrow corridor that matches up with what you see from the exterior, you know, ships coming in and out. It does actually feel like a place that could exist in some sort of sci-fi universe in a way that it doesn't when you just go to another planet. Like Aquila especially, like good lord, it's like little tiny Fallout town, and then that's it. There's really not much else going on there. It's just, it feels weird. But aside from that, I am having fun with the game. It plays so much better than their prior works. I think the weapons feel good. The storyline is pretty engaging. There's some stuff that they're doing with like New Game Plus that I'm not going to spoil it, but it's kind of like very unexpected. And I think once people start to see what they're trying to do at that level, it's gonna get some people talking. Let's just say, like, I'm not gonna say this is like, oh, they've done a Nier Automata, but it's closer to that than what they've done in the past. You know what I mean? So there's cool stuff in here that really impressed me on that regard. So it's a good game.
Okay, let's just wrap up with a couple of questions. This one
Sure
from
thing.
Gary Lucero. Bethesda isn't using ray tracing for Starfield, right? Instead, opting for real-time global illumination. Unlike many of your patrons, I'm not quite smart enough to understand the difference, but was it the right call as far as DF is concerned? Who wants to take that one? Oliver?
Yeah, they aren't using ray tracing. They're doing some kind of real-time GI system. I don't know if it's based on their kind of cube maps or what they're doing, but I think the principal difference would be that the level of detail, you're not getting a per pixel level of detail in that resolve. You know, you're getting a pretty decent, I would say, impression of GI in some areas. Like when you look at certain overhangs that have very obvious color, there is some very obvious bounce in that area, and it does contribute to the overall lighting setup of the game, but it's not giving you like that really nice per pixel goodness that you'd see in like Metro Exodus, for instance, the enhanced edition.
Right.
It's not nearly as granular as that.
It's not localized correctly like that. What you get with a per pixel solution, like when it's reflecting across the underside of like an overpass or something, or within a tunnel, the light kind of leaks through, right? I think they might be sampling the cube maps for their lighting data, because it does seem to correspond with the shiny objects, where you can also see sort of this like ambient lighting on there. But there could be some other, maybe they're doing some probe stuff. I'm not sure. The main thing here is that they could, trying to do this real time was like their one real option here, right? Because a lot of games rely on completely baked global illumination, and they sometimes combine that with other inputs, but you can't bake out a game like this, really.
No.
Right? The size of the data necessary to do that would be insane. So, you know, they've come up with an interesting approximate GI solution. It gets the job done well enough, but when one of our patrons delved into the CVARs and discovered that there's some kind of ray tracing option in there, it did make me wonder about what those guys had been experimenting with pre-release, and if there's ever some potential for ray tracing in there.
Interesting. Well, let's move on to the final question. This one from Jordan Spano, sorry. Does a game like Starfield benefit from the console exclusivity? If it's meant to push hardware sales for Xbox, is this the reason for the Series S revision, as it's likely to be the more appealing buy-in? That's an interesting point, right? Because I actually think that if you think about what Starfield is doing on PC, it seems to be quite a demanding game, right? And then we look at the quality of the Series S version, which, these machines are so cheap now. I mean, the retail price is $299, but just look around, you can get one a lot cheaper than that, and you're getting a properly decent version of Starfield. It can't help but not be a system seller of sorts for Xbox. What do you reckon, John?
I think it kind of needed to be, and I think it is. It's pretty much the first one of these that Xbox has had, right? Like everything's been totally cross-gen up to this point. And this is the first truly big game that Xbox has had where it's like, you either play it on PC or you got to buy one of the Xbox systems. So I think for that, it's a pretty smart play. And this is what I've always said about why we need these kind of exclusives to push the console sales forward. It's like you need a compelling reason to justify buying another box, right? And I think, typical Joe gamer would have been okay with like an Xbox One version, no matter how poor it may have been of prior games anyway, and just be like, whatever, I just want to play it, right? But by making this series exclusive or PC, if you want to play it, that's the only way you can do it. You got to buy a machine. So I'm sure this will help drive Xbox sales.
I think the game, just to return to that question, I think the game has benefited a lot actually from its console exclusivity, but not for the usual reasons of like targeting a more limited set of platforms, but just because Microsoft allowed them the appropriate amount of time and resources to get this game in such a good state out of the box. We know that a lot of studios at Microsoft collaborated on this game and helped them out if you look through the credits. And we also know that the game was delayed at least once, perhaps delayed internally before then, right? But delayed by 10 months. And that's probably a huge part of the reason as to why the game is so polished right now in September 2023, right? That game was actually pushed back to give them more time. So I don't think that if they're in the third-party scenario that they're delaying that game and giving it all the external help that it really needed to get in as good of a shape as it is now, with the excellent combat, with the motion blur, with all this other stuff. I don't think that's happening.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. It's, they had a lot riding on this game, so I'm sure they poured as many resources as they could to get it out the door in a decent state, which, as you say, may not have happened otherwise and has never happened in the past.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's pretty much everything we've got to say about Starfield, unless you guys have got any final thoughts you'd like to chime in with before I wrap this one up. Do you have any?
It's the beginning of a busy season, right? It's a big game release, and there's a lot more big game releases coming soon. And but I'm happy with this one so far, and I think it's pretty cool. And I think most people seem pretty happy with it as well, even if it has its drawbacks, which, what many games do. And I'm not surprised that this one does as well. But yeah, I'm good stuff.
Your final thoughts, Oliver?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. I mean, I'll probably put another 30 or 60 hours into it before the year closes, and I wouldn't be surprised if it finds a spot on my own personal Game of the Year list. I'm really enjoying it. There are some caveats, mostly related to the scope. I think that maybe if they'd targeted a bit of a smaller scope, that might have ultimately been good for the game. But for what it offers, for the terrific quest design, for the flexibility, for the combat, for the jetpack. I love the jetpack. I think they're doing so much cool stuff in this game, and I really enjoy it.
I had to chuckle. There had to be some caveats. It wouldn't be a DF video without some caveats.
Yeah.
Caveats.
But that's it. That's the end of our DF Direct special for Starfield. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed that Frankenstein's console testing we did at the beginning there. I thought it was quite fun. If you did enjoy it, please do like, subscribe, share, ring the bell for whatever notifications, hopefully. And DF supporter program. Maybe I'll do an edit of some more of that Frankenstein's console footage there, because there's a lot of it as Oliver's download backlog probably indicates at the moment. But yeah, that's all from us for this one. Thanks for watching.